Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and in this video I'm going to talk about playing in the Boomsday Project on a budget. Because the reality is, in Hearthstone, not everybody has all the cards. Some people are those free-to-play warriors who have never spent a penny on the game. And that's okay, because guess what? You can have fun in Hearthstone, only opening a few packs, or maybe just buying a few here and there. You can still be competitive in Hearthstone on a low budget as well. There's things you can do, strategies you can take, certain cards and decks you can play that will still allow you to get a great full Hearthstone experience, even if you're not spending a lot of money or even no money on the game at all. So I wanted to essentially walk through that process and teach you a little bit in case you're wondering how that's possible and show you some of the ways that can be achieved. So up first, although we're not going to talk about it a lot, I'd be remiss not to mention Whiz Bang the Wonderful, a new card in the Boomsday Project, which is basically a dream for budget players. Now, this was already covered in a previous Boomsday Essentials video from Kriparian that I'd love to link you guys in the description below. He'll tell you even more about Whiz Bang the Wonderful and just how wonderful he is. But essentially, this is a card that lets you experiment and explore so many different kinds of cards and decks, basically for the rest of the future of Hearthstone, and it's a great investment for budget players. But of course, not everybody wants to just rely on that one card or deck recipes. If you want to see all kinds of crazy stuff or build your own options or play the most competitive budget decks out there, there are still a couple strategies you can undertake. So specifically, you can build a pre-made deck that someone like myself or another content creator has put together. You can just copy their deck code, put it right into Hearthstone, and get going on a deck that you know is going to be somewhat reliable. Beyond that, you can also start to build your own deck. So taking maybe a free legendary you've gotten, some of the cards you've opened in packs, sticking all that stuff together in a sensible way to give yourself a competitive deck. And depending on what you're looking for and what kind of experience you want out of Hearthstone, both of those are incredibly viable ways to play on a budget, and frankly, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about both. That said, let's go ahead and talk about pre-made budget deck lists and how those might be able to help you. So even when it comes to pre-made decks, there are still actually a couple additional layers here and ways to play pre-made decks. And the first of those are playing a deck that is considered real, or a deck that's complete, or a deck that somebody built that way and that's how they wanted it, and just happens to be fairly affordable when it comes to Arcane Dust. So for instance, if you take a look at this deck, this is a new Legend Mech Hunter from the Boomsday Project. This deck was played successfully to Legend by multiple Hearthstone players. It only costs 4,000 Arcane Dust. Now, that might sound like a daunting amount of dust right away, but hear me out, let's listen. The difference here is that a lot of Hearthstone decks, many high-tier competitive decks, will cost 6,000, 10,000, 15,000, and higher dust. So in the scheme of things, when it comes to complete decks, decks that are considered tier decks, real decks, this is pretty cheap, right? 4,000 dust is on the low side. You'll note there's only one legendary there with Boommaster Flark and only 2 epics with Void Rippers, then a handful of rares, commons, and I guess just one basic card with tracking. But if you're looking to get a really competitive deck and you want to spend all of your dust on one thing and just go all out and play that deck as high and as hard as you can, ranking up from, potentially rank 25 all the way to Legend is possible if you're skilled enough, although don't expect it if you're new to the game right away. But that's the kind of deck this is, and there might be some other examples out there as well. Things like Zoo Warlocks right now probably range from 5,000 to 6,000, and if you go on various sites that are crew decks like Hearthstone Top Decks, Tempo Storm, etc., there are more, you'll be able to find those decks and sort them by dust and find something in that 4 to 6 range. This example was the cheapest one I could find that's already been proven to be good in the Boomsday Project meta. So if you're willing to commit to this, it's a deck that's going to work, it's going to find success, and it's relatively cheap. But when it comes to me and when I talk about budget decks, I still think 4,000 dust is a pretty big hill to climb. That's a lot of packs being opened. That's maybe requiring you to disenchant cards in your collection that you're not really comfortable disenchanting. So when I talk about budget decks, I often lower the bar even farther and like to stay closer to 1,000 to 1,500 Arcane Dust instead. That's far more achievable for most new or growing Hearthstone players. Not to mention that you can often build a couple decks over time to get a better feel for what's performing best for you. You might be able to adapt to the meta, complete different kinds of quests in your Hearthstone collection so that you're gaining more gold to buy more card packs, etc., etc. So I want to also showcase at least a few early Boomsday Project super budget decks, as I might call them, really strictly tight budget decks that still utilize a lot of Boomsday Project cards, because I know those are the packs you're probably opening if you're new with the Boomsday Project. So a good balance of classic and basic cards, but also some Boomsday Project and select cards from other sets as well that won't break the bank when you're crafting them. So I've provided 3 such examples, which we're going to talk about now. First up is another Mech Hunter, but as you can see, this one comes in at 1,400 dust instead of 4,040. So it's far, far cheaper. It does utilize a lot of the same cards, which is always interesting too, because you can essentially grow this sort of deck into the fuller version later. You're going to be sharing a lot of cards, so you're almost making an investment for future collections or future decks as well. But with this budget Mech Hunter, essentially you cut out the legendary card just in case you don't have it or didn't get it as your free legendary class card for the Boomsday Project. That saves you a lot of dust right off the bat, but the deck still maintains its consistency. So they're both Mech Hunter lists essentially that rely a bit on things like Goblin Bombs with Explodinator, for instance, here, or with the Bomb Toss card, both of which summon 0/2 Goblin Bombs, which provide a lot of unavoidable damage for hunters. Which means, you know, the hunter hero power contributes a lot. So you're just overwhelming your opponent with minions, damage output, and then eventually they just have to succumb to all your bombs and hero powers and minion hits and everything else. So this deck, essentially minion-based curve deck, you play things on curve, starting out with low-cost minions. You magnetize new mechs on top of your old mechs. You continue to apply pressure. You have some interesting cards like Spider Bomb and Fireworks Tech to play into some Death Rattle synergies, which can be really powerful for swing turns. Then you got big minions like the Coppertail Imposter, which is great to play into something like War Gear, where you can get this 9/9 minion on board attacking your opponent's face, which is just perfect because the Coppertail Imposter, so difficult to deal with its stealth effect, and then War Gear just slams it. And even like Frostwolf Warlord is a basic card, which means it doesn't cost you any dust. It's just a part of your collection, so you are guaranteed to have it. And what that essentially means is all those Goblin Bombs that are tending to lay around and stick around on board, suddenly they are rewarded with a giant Frostwolf Warlord as well. So even basic cards can still contribute to game plans with a deck like this. So if you want to go all out, you can play the Legend Mech Hunter, the exact same kind of style of play as those Goblin Bombs, unavoidable damage, stacking damage into Boommaster Flark even, or you can go for the cheaper version. It will not be as competitive, it will not be as easy to win, but it can still help you climb the ladder, you can still gain a lot of ranks, and you can build on this for the future as well. Now, beyond that, we have the budget mech Paladin here, which again utilizes a lot of mechs. You'll see some familiar cards and similar cards in this list compared to the last one, and the strategy is also incredibly similar as well. Early minions that allow you to stack up lots of damage. You can even see things like Blessing of Might in this deck from the basic set that helps you just get an additional attack buff on your minions so that you can either take value trades or just push for lots of additional damage. This deck also utilizes a lot of magnetic cards like a Noyo module that can be really defensive and annoying and create problems as your opponent tries to resolve your board. And even things like Mechano Egg down there at the end becomes a scary 8/8 when you're able to taunt it up or able to kill it off because your opponent has to. So essentially, you create all kinds of friction and difficult things for your opponent to do while continuously just stacking up mech value, pushing for lots of additional damage, and eventually out-tempoing them. And then you even have backup plans like Divine Favor in this deck that once you play out your hand, you can draw even more cards and just start all over again with even more mechs. So another pretty aggressive mech style deck, but this time around in Paladin with another hero power that complements it pretty nicely. And then finally, something a little bit different this time around, the same sort of archetype or style of play in that it's a minion-based aggressive deck. And by the way, that might seem familiar, and we're going to talk about that a little more later in the video, because archetypes are tough on a budget. You have to stick to certain archetypal patterns, and that's why all of these super budget decks do that exactly. So this time around, the budget Demon Warlock utilizes some cool new cards from Boomsday Project like Void Analyst, which buffs demons in your hand when it dies, and with cards like Doubling Imp and Serenite Chain Gang that also double themselves, suddenly the value return on things like Soul Infusion and Void Analyst, which can respectively buff both of those minions. Void Analyst only buffing the demon, but Soul Infusion buffing anything. Suddenly you start to stack these really big scary minions on board in the mid-range that often your opponent just can't deal with, and they get to hit for a lot of damage on top of things like Soulfire and all kinds of other super aggressive Flame Imps and Witchwood Imp plays and Demon Fires and Vulgar Homunculus and all these other fast demons that get buffs, you eventually just overwhelm, and then you finish your opponent with things like Doom Guard as well for lots of damage off the top late in the game. And Zoo Warlocks like this, really powerful archetype right now in Hearthstone. Again, this is not a perfect version. It's a budget version, but still incredibly competitive, fast, wins you games, and it's great for laddering at only 1,440 dust. So another great example that can get you into Hearthstone playing and winning very affordably when it comes to Arcane Dust, and especially because this uses a lot of Boomsday Project cards as well. This one's going to be fun and powerful to craft. And there are some examples of 2 different kinds of budget decks to play, a few different classes as well, and I'll say that this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are lots of other budget decks that will pop up as we start to get into the expansion and see some of the better lines and how the meta starts to settle. I will certainly be posting future budget decks myself as well on this channel. I always make budget decks every expansion, so you can keep an eye out on those the next few weeks and month or so. There will be most classes will be getting budget decks in some sort or another. So don't consider this the only options you have, but they are some great, reliable, consistent, and predictable options right now early in the Boomsday Project meta. You can start with these and start winning. And by the way, the deck codes and the lists for all of these decks are in the description below. So if you're looking to copy these, just hit the description and it'll be very easy and convenient for you to get started right away. So that said, now that we've talked about playing pre-made decks, playing decks that somebody else made for you, that's easy and it can still be a great experience. But I know for some people out there, there's a certain thrill and excitement in playing cards that you already opened and putting together a deck yourself and trying to overcome the deck building challenge, not just relying on somebody else's work. It's okay to do that, but it can often be more rewarding and more fun to make your own thing or use some special or exciting card that you got. And that's the next thing I want to talk about, which is building a budget deck yourself using cards that you might already have. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Now, when it comes to building your own budget deck, I will say that's a pretty challenging thing to do, particularly if you're a new player, but with a lot of trial and error and experimentation, it can be a really fun thing to do as well. It can be exciting and rewarding. So it's not that I discourage you, I just want to give you a couple tips as you go down that journey of making your own cheap or affordable deck. And again, that kind of lines up along 2 different angles. So first up, I think it can be really helpful to build around a specific legendary card. Often legendary cards can be deck defining or help you set up an archetype or a game plan or a win condition that's really going to help you cement what your deck is trying to do. Because if you build a deck without a win condition or without a singular game plan, it's often going to struggle and it won't find a lot of success in a competitive setting. So I wanted to identify some of the legendary cards from the Boomsday Project that I think best accommodate building a deck around them. Now, I will say not every legendary is well suited to this task. Some legendaries are more complementary or a part of a combo, and it might be harder to create a deck, but there are a few standout options. Now, don't get discouraged if you don't have one of these legendaries, if these weren't one of your free legendaries, that's okay. You can still, if you got one of these in packs, or if you want to dedicate the dust, that's an option. Or if you got another legendary, you can still try it. And guess what? You also don't have to play legendaries. Not every deck needs to be defined by a legendary. I just wanted to call out some of the great options that do exist if you happen to be lucky and get one of these select cards. So up first is Kangor's Endless Army for Paladins. This is their new legendary spell. And as you'll see from reading this card, it's all about mech synergies, and we already identified some of the potential that exists for Paladin when stacking magnetic buffs on top of minions, creating those crazy giant eggs that have an 8/8 lingering inside of them. Suddenly, those become even more powerful with a card like Kangor's Endless Army. If you really play into that magnetic playstyle, this can give you a giant board of stuff getting resummoned that your opponent often just can't deal with. It's too much and allows you to just swing the game really hard and punch them in the face for tons of damage. So this alone can help you really redefine that mech style play, give you an extra win condition. So in case you didn't hit your curve perfectly or they managed to keep up with you, this gives you another option, another finisher piece, and clearly sets a strong definition for your deck. Now, moving on, for Warrior, we also had Dr. Boom Mad Genius introduced in this expansion, and often with hero cards like this one, they're very, very good and do help you define a deck almost by themselves, or at the very least, help you win games because they generate so much ridiculous value. And that's true with Dr. Boom Mad Genius as well. And as you can see with this card as well, it's all about mech synergies. Now, we didn't create a budget mech warrior deck for our pre-made deck list previously, so you might have to be a little bit more creative about figuring this one out. But frankly, it only takes a few mechs for Dr. Boom Mad Genius to make sense. His hero powers are so cool and do something so strong every time. They can also generate mechs as well, so he often feeds into his own effect here with every mech having rush for the rest of the game, but it certainly helps to have at least a few mechs in your deck. So you can start to put together a warrior deck that has some survivability enough to get up to Dr. Boom. Then you flip the game really hard on the back of the power that Dr. Boom can provide, giving all of your minions that instant rush activation can really help you swing games. So this is another card pretty easily defines what a mech warrior might be about and would give you a lot of options for creating a powerful in-game state in those sorts of decks. Beyond that, we also have Boom Master Flark here, which we saw a little bit in our very first Legend Mech Hunter, that pseudo-budget deck. Because again, with Boom Master Flark, this guy creates so much unavoidable damage by summoning 4 Goblin Bombs, which presents an 8 damage potential against your opponent. In a Hunter environment, this becomes a really strong finisher because you play out all those mechs. You can still do things like Frostwolf Warlord on a future turn, perhaps, if your opponent doesn't kill those mechs. If you have Void Rippers, you can also flip those to do tons of damage. You can stack magnetic buffs on top of your Goblin Bombs. All of those pieces just come together with Boom Master Flark, and they give you that finishing piece as well. So we've already demonstrated what that kind of deck might look like, and you can see pretty quickly how going down that Goblin Bomb path makes a lot of sense for Hunter. So again, this just tells you basically exactly how you need to start building your deck in a budget sense. And then finally, one last piece here is Ziliax, the neutral mech from the Boomsday Project. Once again, this guy is such a centerpiece for mech decks. He creates so much opportunity. He can flip a game on its axis all by himself because all of these effects get bundled into one, and because he has magnetic, you can put him onto a minion on board and just start to do some crazy things. And then the great thing about Ziliax is also that he works across all of these different sorts of decks. And frankly, he's a fine minion on his own too. He doesn't even really have to have mech synergies to be a playable card. So something like this can really start to tie your whole collection together, pulling different classes into one thing and using one card across all of them for a really powerful effect. So something like Ziliax is almost like a cherry on top all these other lines of creation essentially for budget decks, and I think it would be a great option for anybody who's looking to get competitive in the Boomsday Project right now. This is also the most played legendary card of the Boomsday Project so far, so you can clearly see with this sort of card, it's a very big investment that can pay off for a long time to come. Now, building on top of a legendary is a great strategy, but that's really not the only strategy that's available if you're looking for a budget deck. Maybe you don't have those cards. Maybe you don't want to play a legendary for whatever reason. There are still other ways to think about how to put together a deck and how to piece it all into something that's competitive. And the way I like to think about it is there are certain packages of cards, certain bundles or cards that just naturally fit together and synergize and create the same sorts of game plans or win conditions, but they're not legendaries, they're just a few pieces that fit together. And I wanted to identify some of those in the Boomsday Project as well. Now, again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is not every way to view the game or every potential budget bundle that makes sense, but these are at least a few that can get you started, get you thinking about how to organize these cards together in your brain, and you can venture forth, and I'm certainly sure find some more. So up first, this one might seem obvious because we've talked about it a lot, and that's just because mechs are such a big and prominent part of the Boomsday Project, but there's a great neutral set of mechs that are all incredibly cheap to craft and all work together exceedingly well. And frankly, this isn't even all of them. This is just the 6 that I think are the standouts right now and the ones that are seeing the most play at the moment. But if you just get these 6 cards, you've got this little core of mechs that you'll note curve out really well. You have a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 drop, but also they just work great because things like upgradable Framebot is really survivable on turn 2. And then you can follow it up with a Bronze Gatekeeper and make this giant 2/10 minion that's so cool and so scary, hard to deal with. You've got things like War Gear to stack on top as well, so that can create a lot of big stats all at once. And then your Coppertail Imposter, as we mentioned previously, is just a good thing to assure that it's very likely to live so that you can stack more magnetic stuff on it later. So just these little 6 cards suddenly build a good portion of your deck, and you can start to play on other strategies or pile on other cards that will still fit and you'll still have something that works together. Now, of course, with mechs, the more mechs you get, the better off you're going to be because they all synergize together. But even just starting with 6, 8, 10 mechs will give you a good core to build on. You can put in other package complementary stuff and you'll have a decent game plan moving forward. Now, beyond that, there's another thing like Druid Treants we saw introduced in the Boomsday Project. This is another little set of cards that all go together, and although there's only 4, it's still enough to get you started, and these synergize in such a positive way, and the power level of something like Mulch Muncher is so high as a card that can get reduced down to 0 mana essentially for 8/8. That's kind of crazy, and it can be a huge swing card. Landscaping is just a big pile of minions efficiently for 3 mana. Tending Tauren has a lot of flexibility to play on a token style that you might want to utilize with this sort of deck, and Dendrologists just give you a little value for your Treants as well. And there are certainly other Treant cards available. They're not all going to be cheap, but this is enough to get you started, or at least start thinking about that style of play. Maybe you have a couple other Treant cards lingering around you can stick in here. Living Mana, Force of Nature, those might be epics and fairly expensive to some people, but if you have them, this is another path to go down, or at least you can find some complementary pieces to try to make something like this work. It might not be easy, but it might be okay, and it might lend some great results, and it might be cards that you already have, so it's still something good to consider. Beyond that, we have something else we talked about previously, which are Zoo Warlock buff style cards. We got something Soul Infusion in the Boomsday Project, which so far is one of the most defining cards of the entire set when it comes to play rate and tier influence, because Zoo Warlock right now is basically the best deck in the Boomsday Project in the first week. And Soul Infusion and Doubling Imp are both a big part of that because they work so well together, creating these monster boards on turn 3 or 4 that are just really hard to deal with and allow you to snowball to big advantages. Void Analyst right now not seeing a lot of play because Prince Keleseth is kind of pushing it out, but still a viable alternative that lets you run other cool cards like Vulgar Homunculus, for instance, another cheap card to craft. You saw these cards already in my previous super budget zoo, so it's probably not hard to envision what a deck like this might look like, but you can certainly find other pieces that work really well with this. Things like Omega Agent, for instance, or Serenite Chain Gang, if you have those, might be complementary pieces that go a long way in this sort of package. And then finally, one last thing, again, another one we've talked about it a lot, but you can also go for this Goblin Bomb style of play. These are 3 neutral cards and Bomb Toss. I didn't even include Boommaster Flark on here because he's not really a budget card, but if you start sticking these in a deck and you have ways to either buff their attack so they can activate themselves, things like Direwolf Alpha or Flametongue Totem, that's one way to play Goblin Bombs. Things like Frostwolf Warlord, like we saw. If it benefits from having lots of minions on board, it might work with Goblin Bombs because your opponent probably won't be killing them all that often. And then, of course, there's Hunter as well. We saw a couple different Hunter Goblin Bomb variations that can utilize the style of play very successfully as well. So this is another angle or kind of view you can take on Hearthstone cards on a budget and use these to start putting together a deck. And you even saw me do it just then. I talked about you could use Flametongue Totem, Direwolf Alpha, you could use Frostwolf Warlord. Suddenly your brain starts to say, how can I take these cards and make them work in some sort of environment that I want to play? And that's exactly what each of these card packages will allow you to do. Start the gears turning, give you something to build on, give you some inspiration, and you can start to shape your deck around these specific game plans in a pretty exciting way. And I wanted to include this question mark finally at the end of this portion of the video, because this is not it, right? There's lots of other options. There's lots of other ways to put cards together and make sense, and lots of strategies. You can just look at your collection, see what you have, see which cards seem like they fit together, and start there. Once you start to identify those synergies, you build a deck around them, and boom, you've got something that works, or at the very least, something you can learn from and grow from. And that's a really great experience too. So don't let me limit you. This is more about inspiration than restriction. Take these ideas, run with them, and make something super cool. Now, finally, the last portion of this video I want to talk about is archetypes, and specifically what kinds of archetypes you should aim for when building budget decks. Now, when I'm talking about this, I want to identify that there are really 4 primary archetypes as I see them in Hearthstone. And when I say archetypes, that means like ways your deck is designed or the style of play of your deck. So aggro decks, for instance, are really fast. They want to put a ton of minions on the board, and they want to push you over with lots of pressure and damage. Mid-range decks might be still fairly minion-based, but they tend to curve out a little slower. They might have more powerful turns around turn 5 or 6 instead of like turn 2 or 3. So similar to aggro in a lot of ways, but just slower and still rely on minions and mid-range pressure, but not quite as aggressive. Maybe have a few slower control-style pieces in the mix. Ultimately, though, still looking to end the game via minion pressure. Then you got control decks, which are often much more reactive as opposed to proactive. So control decks might not have as many minions. They might have more spells or weapons or removal tools, so they can react to what their opponent is doing as opposed to playing their own stuff and trying to end the game. They're more about stalling out, defending, removing, outvaluing your opponent instead of out pressuring your opponent. And then finally, combo decks are decks which have some sort of end game situation they're trying to generate. So maybe it's burst damage with a Malagos. Maybe they're trying to set up a Mecha-Thune, for instance. So they often have a lot of survival tools and card draw tools, trying to find these different combo pieces that go together so they can end the game with those combo pieces. And unfortunately, when it comes to budget decks, not all archetypes are created equal. Specifically, I think aggro decks are really good for budget decks. Mid-range decks are certainly viable in a budget environment as well. You can build decent mid-range decks, but unfortunately, control decks are often pretty hard to build on budgets, and combo decks are almost impossible often to build on a budget as well. And the reason control decks struggle is simply because a lot of the time you need late game minions and big legendaries and really powerful stuff to make it work. And often those come at a premium when it comes to Arcane Dust. You know, you might need 5 to 10 legendaries in a control deck that just aren't going to be possible. That's just not going to be available on a budget. That's way too much dust. And then combo decks often have really specific needs. You can't really flex in different cards or make replacements or substitutes. They're really tight, refined lists, and changing out 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 cards will completely break it. Not to mention, you might need specific legendaries or epics that are a specific part of the combo. So, unfortunately, control and combo struggle a lot more than do aggro and mid-range, but that's okay. You'll eventually grow into those. You might find an option way down the road, but aggro and mid-range decks are still a super fun and super, certainly competitively viable way to play Hearthstone. So, at the end of the day, it's not really a big problem, and you still have options. Now, that said, that sums it up. I know I just talked a lot about how to play Boomsday Project on a budget, but I hope you learned a little. I hope that was helpful. I hope you saw some new ways to think about the game, and I hope, frankly, you just had the encouragement to venture out on your own and try it yourself. Because you know what? It's okay if you fail. It's okay if you make a bad deck. It's okay if you lose. That's not a problem. That can be fun. That's a rewarding experience still. I know when I first started, I wasn't just net decking, which is going online and copying decks. By the way, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me, it felt like a much more positive experience, and I think I grew a lot more as a player when I tried to make things work myself. When I tried to figure it out, tried to solve the puzzle, tried to overcome some of these challenges. It made me learn cards. It made me think about the game in new and interesting ways, and I think the same will happen to you. So, although it's totally fine to copy decks and just get right out there and start competing, I would encourage you to spend some time, think about it, make your own stuff, and start really developing as a Hearthstone player. That said, of course, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, recommendations, as always, you're welcome to leave those in the comments below. Either myself or my community will have a lot to share. They'll give you great advice and really positive feedback, so your comments won't go to waste, and I will certainly appreciate you taking the time to do that as well. But until then, I want to thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, I want to say, game on.